Two men were sitting in a small café talking quietly. On the table, there was a full bottle of vodka, half a pizza, and a liter bottle of Coca-Cola. "Lekha, I'm telling you, it's no big deal. Let's go up, come down, have a rest," said a tall, dark-haired man with a thin build. The interlocutor, called Lekha, knocked over a shot of vodka, sniffed a slice of pizza, and quite grunted replied, "Sergei, I'm not a mountain cat to climb on rocks. I'm afraid of heights." Lekha was noticeably shorter than his friend, but stockier. Well-groomed hair, a neat beard, said that the man takes care of his appearance. Sergei smiled, filled the empty stacks, and putting one in front of Lekha, and the other moved to him, continued to persuade his friend. "Lekha, what is the height there?" "So, a small hill." "Will you not keep me and my wife company?" Like at the wedding, you immediately agreed, "But you can't make me go for a walk in the mountains." Sergei raised his shot, urging Lekha to do the same, and after knocking lightly, the friends drank. Lekha again did not take a snack, only coughed into his fist and said in a slightly hoarse voice, "Sergei, you know that I would follow you into the fire, even into the water. You remember, like back then, near Gudrun's." Lekha did not have time to continue, as Sergei took him by the back of the head with his hand and his forehead pressed against his friend's bulb. "I remember, Lekha, that's why I want you to come with us. You are like a brother to me." Sergei let go of his friend's head, leaned back and smiling continued, "Moreover, if Lekha gets tired, I will not carry her alone. Come on, Lek, agree, do not spoil our honeymoon." Lekha smiled back. "Well, if Lekha has to be carried, then I agree. What if you really can't carry her yourself?" Lekha smiled even wider, and the friends firmly struck hands with each other. Sergei, I always help you out. That's why you're my friend." Sergei replied smiling. It took a week to get ready. Sergei, as an experienced tourist, took care of all the logistics. His young wife Helen did not get into the process, because from her side the best help was just not to interfere. Lena is Sergei's wife, a slender, beautiful brunette, a perky and energetic girl. She was ready at any time of the day or night for any adventure. She was actively involved in sports, so she took her husband's suggestion to spend their honeymoon in the mountains with joy and as another adventure. The only thing that embarrassed her was that Sergei was also taking his friend with him. She did not understand why they needed him so much. Especially since she barely knew Lekha, she only met him at the wedding. But Sergei was adamant, constantly referring to some kind of case. He did not so much tell his wife, but simply put her before the fact. Yes, Elena did not particularly resist, fully trusting her husband. Finally, all the preparations were completed, and the three friends gathered together and started their journey. The weather was warm, it was the middle of August, and all three were lightly dressed. The men both wore light camouflage pants and black sneakers. Sergei wore a black t-shirt without any prints, and Lekha was in a white t-shirt. Lena, on the other hand, was dressed in tight-fitting leggings and a bright red tank top. Each of them was carrying a backpack full of the essentials, as Sergei had instructed. Lena's backpack contained only a change of clothes, some dry food, some instant noodles, and personal hygiene products. The men, on the other hand, took the bulk of the load. In addition to the above-mentioned things that were with Elena, Sergei carried in the tent, and Lekha carried a kettle and a sleeping bag. They did not take a second tent, deciding not to burden themselves with unnecessary cargo. Lekha would sleep under the open sky in good weather, and in case of rain, they could easily fit all three of them in the tent. The road went by without much incident and passed for a Sunday picnic. Picturesque places, beautiful nature, and clean air accompanied the good mood of the three friends. After 2 days, the road began to go up steeper and steeper. Deep as canyons, scattered and huge boulders, fancifully shaped by wind and rain, appeared. They were scattered chaotically along the entire route. At the end of the day, having reached a small mountain lake, the friends decided to stop here for the night. They stopped at the top, not far from the trail, under the arch of two huge boulders. A narrow, winding path led to the lake through a small gorge. "So, Lekha, let's get some firewood, while I will set up the tent and start a fire," said Sergei, taking off his backpack from his shoulders. Lekha nodded and dropped his load, and the shoulder went up the path. "Sergei, I'll go for a swim," Lena asked her husband. "Len, why don't we set up camp and all go together?" "Honey, I didn't take my swimsuit. Do you want me to swim naked in front of Lekha?" Lena was offended, pouted her lips, and looked at Sergei. "Okay, go, but be careful, we'll be here soon too." "Thank you, dear." Lena kissed her husband on the cheek and ran down the path to the lake. Lekha, unable to find firewood up the road, decided to go down to the lake. After wandering between the scatterings of rocks, he came down to the grove by the lake and had already started to gather firewood, when suddenly he was attracted by the sound of footsteps. Lekha looked out from behind the tree and saw Lenka coming down to the lake. At first he wanted to call her, but his eyes were caught by the bright red tank top, and Lekha kept silent and quietly watched, guessing correctly the girl's intention to swim. Almost at the lake, Lena for some reason did not go to the water, and sharply turned to the right and began to climb a huge rock, which hung over the top edge of the lake. Lekha sat down, watching as the girl climbed on the rock. He involuntarily admired Lena and swallowed his saliva. Lena finally climbed to the very top of the rock. Against the background of the setting sun, Lekha could clearly see her silhouette. Better, the sun seemed to flow around her, accentuating the seductive shape of the girl. Lena removed the rubber band from her ponytail, unraveling it, and a black waterfall of hair fell down her back. Then she shook her head and pulled her top up. Then the girl took off all her other clothes and exposed her body to the sunlight. Lena stood for about a minute, enjoying the warmth and freedom, and Lekha watched the girl of her hiding place without looking away. Having enjoyed the contemplation of nature, Lena took a couple of steps at the edge of the rock, deftly jumped up and, extending her arms forward, dove into the lake, almost without raising a splash. Lekha swallowed nervously, and making his way between the trees, walked to where Lena was undressing. Deftly, climbing on a rock, he picked up her things and put her underwear in his pocket and slowly began to go down to the lake with the girl's things in his hands. Lena swam for a while and began to go ashore, when suddenly she raised her head at the very exit of the water and saw Lekha with her things in his hands. The girl shrieked and crouched down a little, covering her hands, but the crystal clear water did not hide her body much, but only slightly, and said, "Lekha, what are you doing here?" she asked. "I saw your things lying on the stones. I decided to collect them before the wind blew them away," Lekha said without letting the girl down. "Thank you. Can you turn around? I go out." Lekha shrugged and reluctantly turned away, putting Lena and her things on a small rock by the shore. Lena got out of the water and pulled her top on first. Picking up her tights, Lena shook them up in search of panties, but they weren't there. "Lekha, had you seen my underwear?" Lekha, without turning around, probably shrugged his shoulders. "No, I haven't seen them. Maybe the wind blew them away." Lena sighed and pulled her panties down over her legs. "So, can I turn around?" asked Lekha. "Yes, you can." "Len, maybe you can help me gather some firewood, because I haven't found anything up there, and there's a lot of them here, and the two of us can cope faster." "Yes, of course I will." Lekha stepped aside, letting Lena go ahead, and he walked behind, looking at her. Having gathered some firewood, together they went up to the tent, where Sergei had already put all the things, built the hearth, and even made a small fire. When he saw Lena and Lekha, he exclaimed, "What took you so long? I was going to look for you." Lekha threw wood at the lodge and replied, I barely found the firewood. I had to stomp all the way to the lake. Thank you, Lena. You helped me gather it. Lena smiled embarrassedly, and tossing her part of the firewood next to Lekha's pile went to the tent. I'll change now, she said, and disappeared under the canopy. Sergei saw her off, keeping his eyes on her buttocks, then flashed his eyes over Lekha's face, but did not say anything, and just tossed some firewood and poured some groats into the kettle. Lekha, why don't we have a drink? Suggested Sergei after a few minutes, when the porridge in the pot began to emit a tantalizing smell. Yes, we can, Lekha answered. Then a little bit for me too, added Lena, coming out of the tent, wearing sports tights and a black t-shirt. Oh, then we're not going anywhere tomorrow. Well, that's okay. We'll go for a walk. The weather is nice. We can stay for a day. We are in no hurry, said Sergei, and began to rummage in his backpack for a plastic bottle. Finally, getting it, he collected 3 mugs, poured a little more into 2 of them, and a little more into the third, handed one to the lazy man and the other to Lekha. Well, to the altitude, he raised the improvised glass. To the altitude, replied Lekha. To the altitude, joined Lena. Quite unnoticed, the friends got quite drunk. The fresh air and hot fresh porridge awakened their appetite, and after a couple of hours, when the sun had finally set and the stars in the sky were shining brightly, Sergei was lying on a sleeping bag spread by the fire and snoring loudly. Lena was a little less drunk, and Lekha was still chipper. They sat opposite each other and looked at the burning fire. Yeah, he was really kicking it. Lekha was the first to break the silence. Yeah, I've never seen him like that, Lena replied breathlessly. Lekha grinned, remembering how and in what form he saw his friend. But Lenny didn't say anything. Maybe we should move him to the tent, Lekha suggested. Lena looked at her husband, listened to him snore, then looked up at the sky. No, I don't think so. The weather is good, will not freeze, and will be there in my ear snoring, will not let me sleep. Lekha snorted again. Well, in fact, he sleeps on my sleeping bag, not on the rocks for me to sleep. If you want, you can sleep in the tent. I hope you do not snore, answered Lena. Lekha lifted his head and looked into her eyes, noticing some incomprehensible glint in them. Probably a glint of fear, he thought, and shook his head. No, I don't snore. Lena shot her eyes at Lekha, then looked up at the sky again, and yawning into her fist said, I should probably go to bed. Good night, Lekha. Good night, Lena. I'll stay up a little longer. The girl disappeared into the tent. Lekha sat and silently looked, now at the burning out fire, now at his sleeping friend. Inwardly, he was tossing and turning between his friend and his wife. Lena rustled something in the darkness of the tent, starring Lekhan's imagination. The glow of the fire reflected in his eyes, and he quickly got up and went to the tent. Pulling back the shelf, Lekha climbed inside. It was quiet in the tent. Not even the girl's breathing could be heard. The man lay down in the middle and quietly asked, Lena, are you asleep? No, the girl answered quietly. And Lekha realized that she is by the wall of the tent to the right of the entrance. Lekha was silent. He still did not dare to move to active actions. He did not dare to break that fine line. Lekha? Yes. What do you need my panties for? Lena asked in complete silence. Lekha was a little embarrassed, and after a minute he answered, For a memory. Give me back, please. But if it's so necessary, take it and take it back. There was a slight rustling sound, which made Lekha realize that the girl had got out from under the sleeping bag and was slowly moving toward him. He lay on his back and soon felt the warm caress of a woman on his belly. Where are they? Asked Lena. Lower, in his pocket. Slightly hoarse-voiced answered Lekha. Lena's hand slid down his stomach. She ran her hand down his left thigh, fumbled for his pockets, slipped her hand into it. The pocket was empty, and Lekha smiled inwardly and said quietly, "In the other one." Lenya had to move closer to Lekha and lift slightly to reach the right pocket. Lekha could no longer resist. He pulled the girl down on top of him and, in the total darkness, fumbled for Alina's lips with his own. He kissed her greedily. The girl didn't resist. She pressed herself against him, responding to the kiss. There were rustles and slaps in the tent, and Sergei lay quietly on the sleeping bag, and the embers of the burned-out fire, or his eyes, glittered dully near his head. The morning was overcast. Clouds covered the sky and promised torrential rain. Sergei sat by the fire and thoughtfully looked at the kettle, which was beginning to boil. Lekha was the first to leave the tent. "Good morning, Sergei. How are you?" "I'm fine, but what did you look like yesterday? Did you have too much to drink?" Sergei was stingy and smiled. "I have a headache," he answered, and looked at the sky and added, "We should take off and go back. It's going to rain." "Lekha is still asleep." "Yes, I don't think I've checked." Dark-eyed Lekha answered, "Wake her up. Let's drink coffee and go back." Lekha looked at his friend in surprise, but said nothing and went to wake up the girl. Sergei followed him with a glance and spat into the fire. Lena woke up. Friends drank coffee in complete silence, and after curtailing the camp, began to descend. The clouds covered the sky with an impenetrable blanket, concentrating somewhere near the top of the mountain. The rain began to fall. It gradually intensified and soon came down in a solid wall. Sergei went first, Lena went behind him, and Lekha was at the back of the procession. All the Mura was silent. Only the squelching footsteps to the noise of the rain broke the silence. Suddenly, there was thunder, but the thunder was unusual. It did not quiet down. On the contrary, it became louder and louder. Sergei looked around, his eyes widened with horror, and he shouted loudly, "Run!" Lekha and Lena turned their heads and saw a torrent of mud rushing right at them. Rocks and trees mixed with earth were hurtling toward them at breakneck speed. All three of them jumped out of their seats and, slipping on the wet rocks, ran as fast as they could down the path. Sergei realized that they could not get away, or frantically looked around in search of at least some shelter. And thankfully not without himself. He saw a small path leading to a high ledge. "Follow me," he shrilled shrilly, and rushed up the cliff. Lena followed him, and behind, helping the girl up, Lekha jumped. Sergei reached the ledge and now watched his wife and friend climb up. Almost reaching the top, Lena suddenly slipped and rolled down. Lekha reached out and grabbed her hand at the last moment, keeping her from falling into the roaring mass of mud. Lekha screamed, his hand slipping off the rock, and Lena dragged him down with her weight. The girl squealed in fear and twitched, trying to throw Lekha down with her. "Lekha, don't let me go." "Lekha, please," she screamed. Lekha held on, gritting his teeth, but inexorably slipping away. Suddenly, the rope fell right on Lenin's head. "Grab it quickly." Overlapping the noise of the mud flow was Sergei's loud voice. Lena grabbed the rope and Sergei dragged her up. Dragging her to him, Sergei shouted, "Hold on, Leva," and threw the rope to him. The mud flow had already become a little smaller, significantly lowering the level, but it continued to move at the same speed. The rope fell down next to Lekha. He let go of one hand to grab the rope, but his fingers slipped and Lekha rolled down, straight into the noisy stream. The current picked him up, swirled him among the rocks and trees, and with force struck the rock, threw his body on the platform sticking out below, where Sergei and Lena had found. A rocky ledge. Sergei looked down. Lekha was lying, arms outstretched, not moving. He looked up the path, saw that a new, even first mud wave was coming from the slope. Instantly, having made a decision, Sergei tied one end to a protruding rock and tied the other end around his waist. Lena, who was watching his preparations, shouted, "Sergei, don't go. My love, don't go there. Please don't go." She fell to her knees and wrapped her arms around his legs, continuing to scream hysterically. "Fuck you." Sergei pushed his wife roughly away from him and, slipping on the rocks, began to go down to Lekha. When he reached the platform where Lekha was lying, he lifted him up and began to tie a rope around him, pulling him tightly to himself. The stream of mud was already near, but this time it was not as muddy and not as strong as the first. Quickly realizing that he couldn't make it upstairs in time, Sergei grabbed the rope with one hand and with the other hand, holding his friend as tightly as possible, pressed himself against the rock. "Hold on, Lekha," he shouted, and Lena, hanging her head down, saw how her husband was covered with a mud flow. The girl screamed, covered her face with her hands, and fell unconscious, sprawled out on the playground. The flow was over very quickly. Sergei shook his head, throwing off the muddy water from his hair. Coughing loudly, he looked at his friend. "Lekha, Lekha," he called loudly, shaking him by the shoulders. Lekha slowly opened his eyes and sneezed. Sergei smiled. "Live," he exhaled with relief. Lekha turned out to have a broken leg and a lot of other bruises, but overall he was fine. Lena was also awake, and after the flow finally cleared, they descended the ledge, went down the slope. Sergei was dragging Lekha on his back. "How then?" "Near Guderm's," said Lekha, hanging on his friend's shoulder. "Yes, Lekha, like that time. Only in reverse. Hold on, friend." Lekha gritted his teeth and held on, and Lena dragged behind, ducking her head. When we got to the first settlement, we helped, and a week later they made it home. Sergei filed divorce papers. He never saw Lekha again. Everyone understood everything perfectly.